Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and this is going to be the first in a new style of dedicated podcast, really, although it's going to be going up on the YouTube channel as well, just to discuss things that have been suggested to me where I can talk at length, really, without a script, without having to keep it down to a certain length of time. And I asked people to suggest certain topics, and some of those topics in there I'm going to be covering as well. But the first, one of the main things people wanted was my particular insights on what led up to the riots that we've seen in the UK recently. I've done a number of videos on those. But in terms of from my perception, one question that was asked by a few people is, how were we taken surprise by these riots? In a sense, we weren't. We obviously didn't know they were going to kick off this month. There was no suggestion it was going to kick off this month. It was definitely an emergency that the new government won't have had specific warning about. Although it was interesting because it's been described, I described it myself as Keir Starmer's first emergency. Now, specifically an emergency that didn't already know about. There's actually lots of emergencies going on in the UK that we knew about. The chickens coming home to roost after 14 years of the Tories basically doing nothing. But this is one for which he won't have specifically known about. But if it's quite weird in a sense. If you're going to give a brand new government, a party that's been out of power for 14 years, if you're going to give them a sudden emergency within a matter of weeks of forming that government, it's weird that the emergency was one that Keir Starmer has already dealt with in the past, for which he's got experience, because he was the chief prosecutor who dealt with the riots in 2011. And we've now got the person who dealt with those riots from a criminal justice point of view leading the government. But people had warned about the risk of major violence erupting for years. We'd been seeing it build up. In the wake of the Brexit referendum, we had racist attacks massively increasing. A lot of people who voted for Brexit say, "Oh, I'm not racist." Yeah, great. I'm sure many of them weren't. The thing is, it's one of those situations. Not everyone who voted for Brexit was racist, but almost all racists voted for Brexit. And you know what? The racists thought that everyone that voted for Brexit was like them. They don't necessarily always think of themselves as racist, but many know they are. So it's like it gave them license. They believed that their racist views were shared by a majority, because you may have voted for Brexit for various reasons, if indeed you voted for Brexit at all, but they thought you were voting for the same reasons they did. And so racist attacks increased as these people felt that they were part of the majority. And there were various, there's other times when we've seen a spike in racist attacks as well. When Boris Johnson has made Islamophobic and other racist comments, we've seen an increase in racist attacks. Even with the recent riots, with most of the public making it clear they're outraged at the riots, racist attacks, including racially motivated verbal attacks against ethnic minorities, has increased. Some parts of the NHS have been reporting that members of staff have been receiving racist abuse. And actually, I've seen some parts of the NHS have actually said, if you racially abuse in any case, but at the moment, if you racially abuse our staff, unless your condition is life-threatening, you can get out of there. We're not treating you. Maybe that should be a more universal policy. In fact, I'd like to see the government maybe showing some leadership on just basic manners, because we're actually a weirdly polite country in the UK. I know it doesn't always look it when you look at some of the yobs that represent us around the world. But manners has a certain appeal to people in Britain. You should see people go mad if you try and, for example, cut into a queue. We have a weird sense of manners. And I think the government could use that. They could use that to actually make it, because what we need to do is we need to make racism socially unacceptable again. We were making progress on it at a time when I was born in the mid-70s, and violent racism was incredibly bad in the 70s. I can't attest to it to myself, I was far too young, but I can say that racism was basically front and centre everywhere in the 80s when I was growing up. Racist language was everywhere. It was mainstream. And then we started to sort of push back against it, and, you know, very much led by the government. And people would bristle about political correction. Oh, it's political correction. Why do we need political correction? It's only words. Yeah, but words have the power to hurt people. And there are other words you could use. If you're saying something that is not in itself racist, you don't need to use racist language. There are other words you can use, aren't there? So we had this sort of pushback, and we were starting to make it socially unacceptable to be bigoted in many ways. And there was real progress being made. And then it all seemed to, about 10 years ago, get thrown in the bin. And it's gone back the other way, to the point where we've sort of normalised racist language again. Not necessarily the same racist language. There's some language that was used perfectly freely in the 80s that still wouldn't be now. That is still socially unacceptable. But it has been replaced with new racist language, targeting largely the same people as well. But in terms of the riots and what will have led up to them, I mean, there are multiple strands you'd have to look at. And, you know, I would echo the calls of many others that the government need... I know there's public inquiries for so many things at the moment, but there does need to be a real review of lots of the underlying issues, because there are some people who fear, quite rightly, that it'll be too easy to focus on one or two of the underlying causes when there's actually a lot. It's actually a very, very complex problem. And indeed, I'm going to be just focusing on just a few of them. But in terms of what specifically led to the violence, I would say that I think there are three main strands to look at. The first is the sort of fortress mentality, nativist attitudes of the far-right agitators and rioters, and where they sort of came from. The second is the deliberate, for various reasons, but deliberate platforming of racist, anti-immigration, Islamophobic and anti-multiculturalism in the media, including from respectable outlets like the BBC, without even coming close to critical analysis or calling out obvious lies, or even balancing opposing views set against them. And third would be the networks that were deliberately built up to facilitate these sorts of attacks, because this has been built up for years, including the infrastructure that was needed to organise the riots at very short notice, on the scale that they were conducted, which our government and security services failed to counter. So, you know, if we think about the attitudes first, so where do the attitudes come from? Well, it's always really weird when you've got these people go, we want our country back. And they're quite clear about what they mean by their country. They mean white. That's what they mean. White, Anglo-Saxon. They're not Irish either. Just Anglo-Saxon white, as they, in the terms they think of it. And, you know, and you look at this as someone who knows Britain, and you think, but this makes no sense. Because Britain has always been multicultural. Not just in my lifetime. Always. Like, if you take Geordie, for example, people from the northeast around Newcastle, and it can be, you know, you listen to people like proper Geordies speaking, and it can be confusing for a lot of people. Now, all regions in Britain have their own dialects and, to a certain extent, little language, because our language built up pre-industrial age. So there's lots of, like, words and things like that and phrases that are used locally in one region and no one else around the place knows them. I mean, I don't go full Yorkshire. I don't speak in my, like, normal, for my broadcasts, because people wouldn't understand me. So I adopt what I call teacher speak. I mean, I was a teacher before I did this. So I adopted a pattern of speaking that could be understood more universally. So cutting out a lot of my sort of regional dialect. Because, but you look at, you know, Geordie, for example, it's literally two languages jammed together. You've got English and Danish in there. You know, English is, even in terms of like the King's English, the English that is understood universally across Britain, is a mongrel language in itself. It's a result of immigration from all over the place. Not just over years or decades or even centuries, but millennia. So when these people talk about wanting their country back, and as I say, what they mean is white Anglo-Saxon, it doesn't make sense, because Britain has never been that. You know, the England they dream of has never existed. We've always been a cultural melting pot. And yet, that feeling in their heads has to have come from somewhere. We can't just dismiss it as, well, you're not making sense, mate. Are you drunk? Actually, a lot of them are drunk. But we have to understand where it's come from. And what I think is that although Britain itself has been very, very multicultural for a very long time, there are some parts of the country where immigration has been more noticeable than others. So ports, for example, or even, the south. The reason why the south, and particularly the southeast of England, has the densest population is because if you were going to, like in centuries past, if you were going to immigrate to Britain from the continent, you're going to hit the southeast of England. And if you didn't really feel the need to go much further, well, why would you? This is probably why Scotland is mostly empty and the southeast of England has a lot more people in it. And the same with America, for example. The east coast of America has most of the actual, or a great deal of the actual population, because once you'd emigrated to America, unless you felt the need to go further, and some did, you just sort of stayed there. You'd got to where you wanted to go. If you could settle down there, you settled down there. But that has meant that there are some communities that even 30, particularly in, for example, parts of the north of England and the North Midlands, that even 30 years ago were basically all white. I mean, the country itself wasn't, but there'd be pockets, little towns, sometimes not always little towns, where it basically was white. You would go out and you would hardly ever meet anyone that wasn't white, even like 30, 40 years ago. And I think what some of these people, they're remembering that, but because they never went out, they never ventured outside of that community, they thought that's what England was, because they never went anywhere. They were born in a place, they grew up in a place, they got a job in a place. All they did was stay there. They didn't go anywhere. If they went anywhere, it was on holiday. And if you go on holiday, it might have been a foreign holiday, Spain or somewhere like that. But they just thought that was England. And all they ever saw was white people. And, I think, back to when I was growing up, I grew up in Doncaster, a village in the east of Doncaster. Vast majority white. I mean, you think about the country now, it's like 80 something percent white. It's a vast majority still white in this country, and yet there were certain communities where it wasn't like 80 or even 90% or 95%. It's like over 99% white. In my junior school, in my year, there were a couple of kids who weren't white. When I went to comprehensive school, I think it was only about the same, 2 or 3. Everyone was white. And I think these people were sort of remembering back to their isolated little communities. They never went out. They never saw multiculturalism. So they think it's a recent phenomenon. And they may also associate that with when times were better from their point of view. I say in a lot of cases, a lot of reasons why a lot of these people may be older people that have these attitudes, these racist attitudes, is quite a lot of the time when older people are thinking, it was so much better back then, and they draw spurious links as to why that is. Quite often it's just that they would remember when they were younger. I mean, they're old and knackered now. Everything's an effort. But when they were younger, everything was brilliant. They were full of hopes and dreams, all the rest of it. And life was maybe better. But there may be some ways in which life was better. For example, housing was, 40 years ago, housing was more affordable. Jobs were easier to come by. Or at least they had jobs that they were happy with. You could have a chippy tea without having to take out a mortgage. And they've been conned into thinking that this sort of lowering of standard of living has been caused by multiculturalism, and it's probably worked more on people. So it's probably not going to work on people so much in communities that were very, very obviously multicultural, well beyond people. Like there's people in this country who have lived in communities that have been very obviously diverse ethnically and culturally beyond living memory, and they'll just look at this and go, well, what time are you remembering? Because this time never existed, just as I do on a national scale. But you're probably talking about people who largely grew up in these communities where it was easy to cloister yourself against it. Because if you never went out, if you never travelled, if you never really went out into the country, if your entire life revolved around going from your house to when you were young to school to like the street where you played football with your mates, and then when you got a job, between your job and your house and the boozer, if that was your life, then yeah, you could well imagine that that was England and that that's how it was across the country. It never was. And so, yeah, and they've maybe seen, coinciding with the fact that, oh, our community's changing, I'm seeing more people that aren't white, with the lowering living standards, which actually isn't caused by that. It's caused by the fact that we've let billionaires get more billionaire-y, and particularly badly over the last 15 years or 14 years under the Conservatives. So they're drawing the spurious link, and they're not randomly drawing the spurious link. They've been told to draw that link. You know, it's worth considering, for example, why the far right particularly reserve their major hate for Muslims. You know, is it because Islam is the most different to their culture? Is it just an example of culture shock? I mean, some elements maybe, but I mean, the biggest difference culturally between British Muslims and, you know, these people is, well, Muslims don't eat pork or drink alcohol, but that just means more beer and bacon sarnies for everyone else. So I don't think they're going to complain about that. So I think it's more likely a combination of a couple of things. The first is that there's a significant Muslim population in certain parts of the country, and they are predominantly Asian, but I could say black or Asian. Only 6% of Muslims in the UK are white. So Islamophobia is a convenient outlet for good old-fashioned racism based on skin colour. But you don't want to say you're racist. You don't want to say you're against people with different colour. So you talk about immigration, or you talk about, you know, Muslims, something like that, in the sort of weird belief that these people didn't exist in the country until recently. And the association's really quite strong. So to the point where they will assume that if they see anyone of South Asian origin, they just assume they're Muslim. Like, these were people who were describing Rishi Sunak as Muslim. There's, oh, we've got our first Muslim prime minister. It's like, no, mate, he's Hindu. Which raises another issue. So why aren't we seeing the same level of hate against Hindus and Sikhs? You know, again, most of whom are not white in the UK. And this is where the media comes into it, because a lot of these people don't like those either. They are actually, the core of them are actually racist. And they're also anti-Semitic, but they don't push that so much because it reduces their pool of potential allies. They go with the thing that unites them all, which is Islamophobia, pushed by the media, because that raises that issue as well. There's been a real effort in the media, and by some in politics, to provide a false narrative via biased reporting. So you get, for example, serious crimes committed by Asian people, and it's all over the news, all over. Big splash made about it, goes on for days. If the crime was very violent, what immediately happens? It's instantly described as a terror attack. Guaranteed. Absolutely guaranteed. You know, if someone of Asian descent violently attacks someone to the point where they kill them, or it's attempted murder, it will definitely be described as a terror attack before the police even talk about the possibility of terror charges, right? When white people commit the same crimes, first of all, it's almost never described as terror attacks, even when they are. For example, the CPS have said they're looking at terror offences for some of those involved in the riots. How many headlines have you seen referring to acts of terror connected to the riots? I haven't seen any. But also, when white people commit the same crimes, terror-related or not, they're reported very differently. They're just like matter of fact, oh, this report thing, these are going to jail. It's all designed to create the impression, to create a sensationalism around crime committed by people who aren't white, and particularly by people who may be Muslim. You know, it's trying to give the impression that certain crimes, particularly violent crimes, are disproportionately committed by certain groups, when actually the reverse is true. You know, the far right try to claim that immigrants are more likely to commit violent crimes. They say so explicitly, but the stats say they're actually less likely. So a smaller proportion of immigrants commit violent crimes as compared to the general population, the British population. And the media has actively promoted these false facts, which has bled into the way people see things. And they've done it for there's different reasons, there's different motivations. On the part of some of them, they actively want to push this disinformation. On the part of others, it's just simple business. It's clicks. Outrage gets clicks. They want lots of views on their programs. They want lots of clicks when they're sharing things on social media. And they just have no morals about the damage they may cause in chasing those quick clicks. Because, you know, it's a bit like, you know, we see the same thing on social media. There was in America a few years ago, and some people so desperate for views on their channel. I can't remember which platform it was. Some social media platform. I don't know whether it was YouTube or not, but a video sharing platform. And they were so desperate and they were struggling to get views because everyone wants to build up a social media channel and get the views. And they did this stunt where the guy held a Bible in front of him and his partner shot it with a gun and the Bible was going to stop it. And it didn't, and he died. And, you know, the mad things people will do for views. And you think, well, that's just two people. They're idiots, basically, aren't they? But the same motivation exists for people in the media as well. I mean, their livelihoods depend on it. That is their job. It's not like a side thing they want to do. That is their job. They get paid a lot of money. And the demand on them is that they have to get a lot of views. So morality goes out the window a bit. And the thing is that a lot of people don't realise the media is lying to them. Because why should they? Why should they realise the media is lying to them? If multiple media outlets that seem to be very different types of outlet are pushing the same message. Like, it's different if you're getting different perspectives. You might watch BBC and ITV and Sky News and, you know, read the Times and the Telegraph and the Mail, and, you know, where you get different perspectives, maybe you think, oh, there's a bit of spin here. But if you, although a lot of people don't read that many or watch that many, they tend to stick to one or two that feed their prejudice as the best. So they don't even get that. But where you get a common theme emerging, you start to think, well, that must be the truth. Where there are all these different outlets are crossing over, therefore must be the truth. Whereas in reality, it may just be that actually all those crossovers are what gets the views. You know, so multiple media outlets all pushing the same message. Why should people suspect it? Most people don't have time to fact check journalists. They don't even realise they need to. They assume professional standards should be at work. We should be able to assume that. It's just there aren't. And you know, for example, we have absolutely no real press regulation at all. What little press regulation we have in this country, the people who regulate it are the press themselves. They regulate themselves. It's absolute madness. Even broadcast, which has more regulation and in theory independent oversight, we know that the regulator is very weak on that. You know, for example, they've dismissed an awful lot of really terrible behaviour on the part of GB News on the basis, oh, we're not really sure they're a news programme. And, you know, what's happened is a lot of these people have been fed this diet of disinformation over many, many years. And they're fed this idea that British values are under threat. But it's quite weird because whenever you ask them what British values are, it tends to be the things they're fighting against. And they also go, and it's because they don't integrate. They come to this country and they don't integrate in our society. But actually, as David Lammy, Foreign Secretary, has just said this weekend, it's actually the far right who failed to integrate into British society. And this is exactly right. It's not just a clever way of turning it back on them. It is correct, because the reason it's possible for these people to believe the lies in the media, it's not possible to believe all this stuff if, for example, you are integrated into your community. If you know people who are Muslim or Jewish or Sikh or Hindu, black or white or whatever, you know, if you are integrated into a multicultural society, you can't be told that Muslim is a violent religion because you go, well, I know loads of Muslims, they're all really nice people. You know, it doesn't work on you. It only works on people who are isolated, who don't know these people as people, who see them as others. You know, who aren't connected to them. These people aren't connected to Britain. The ones who say they want our country back, they're not connected to Britain. They're isolated. You know, that Britain has been multicultural for thousands of years. It's never not been before it was inhabited. Britain is one of the most multicultural countries in the world, and it is not a recent thing. The only reason some people have failed to notice is because they isolated themselves. They lived in places that didn't have much noticeable ethnic or cultural diversity until recently, and they certainly never went out and about finding it. So they isolated themselves. They didn't go anywhere. So they don't actually know anything about their country outside of that isolated existence, that personal experience in a town, or more probably their local pub, for years. You know, there have been calls for, as I say, major reviews into the riots, including why certain communities were more vulnerable than others. Because despite the scale of the violence, most places were essentially untouched. Although I suspect more needs to be learned by finding where the rioters came from rather than where the violence was caused. As I've discussed recently, Liverpool is one of the most proudly and knowingly multicultural places in England. Yet their city was still threatened and attacked. But none of the places represented by Reform UK MPs, which are all hotbeds for this sort of feeling, which is why they voted Reform UK, none of them were attacked, were they? Ashfield wasn't attacked. Clacton wasn't attacked. Skegness wasn't attacked. What's that about then? You know, did it have as much to do with the careful targeting of places as much as where they might be a local supply of the thugs necessary? Because as well as the underlying causes of the feelings which encourage people to act with such violence, a major factor, the third factor, is the deliberate strategy, that the infrastructure behind the scenes which built up to push the disinformation and to organise the attacks. You know, because riots broke out in a lot of places in a very short time, but they weren't riots in the normal sense. You know, these weren't like the 2011 riots, for example. They began in response to the killing of a black man by police. That's, you know, always going to have the conditions to create a lot of unrest and, you know, and potentially trigger a riot. But that sort of spread to a few other places, but that was opportunistic looting, right? That was just a load of people going, right, let's just kick off here. These recent riots were coordinated. They were actually smaller in scale in terms of the sheer numbers of people taking part than the 2011 riots, but they were spread out across more towns and cities. And the logistics needed to organise that had been in place for a very long time. They were preparing for something like this. You don't just randomly have this happen. They were preparing for it. They won't have had a definite date in mind either. This wasn't planned for a particular date. You know, we talk about the Southport killings being the trigger this. They were ready to trigger it at some point. They were just waiting for an excuse. And then when they saw that excuse, they went, this is our opportunity, we're going to go for it. So it was reactive. But that meant the organisation had to be even better, didn't it? Because it's one thing, it's difficult enough to organise and coordinate these groups, these violent groups, as part of a strategy. If you've got a date in mind, because you're building up to this date, that's actually quite hard in itself. But it's even harder to do it knowing that you don't know when it's going to be, that you're waiting for a sign and you don't know when it's going to be, so that you're always ready, and when it's ready to go, you're just going to put all these things into place. It needed organisation, it needed money. In terms of who gains from this, because that's another question I've been asked, who ultimately gains from this? There are only so many people, ironically, in this country who will gain. There are grifters, there's plenty of grifters, we know who they are, the likes of Nigel Farage and Tommy Robinson and the likes, gain from, well, we hope they won't gain from this. We hope that this will be the thing that says, no, you've gone too far now, although we should have done that a long time ago. We will see. But so far, those individuals have been gaining from this financially, as well as in terms of notoriety, which they may both enjoy as well. But there's plenty of foreign actors. It's entirely in their, you know, the UK it's in their interest to destabilise the UK. It's why there's quite a lot of people who are behind this, who were also behind Brexit. You know, it's whether they just want to stop Labour being successful in government, or whether they can gain personally from it, or they just want us to focus on putting out fires in our own country so we can't pay attention to the damage some of these foreign actors are causing around the world. You know, there's plenty of reasons, and obviously Russia looms large whenever you talk about anything of this. How instrumental the Russian state was in organising or funding any of this, I couldn't possibly say. But if you were to present this to the Kremlin as this is a thing that's happening in the UK, good or bad for us, they would say good. They'll be absolutely delighted with this. In fact, there has been Russian state propaganda pushed on the UK riots, very much in line with Elon Musk. And then you look at Elon Musk, you think to yourself, why is it at the moment he's spending every waking like almost every tweet seems to be about the UK, and you think, well, I mean, maybe he is actually just insane these days. That is actually possible. Maybe he's just genuinely lost it. Something snapped in his brain, right? But America surely is his chief concern. He's trying to get Trump elected for whatever reason. But Musk has clearly made it his mission to stand with those who want to bring authoritarianism to liberal democracy of the West, who's not just focused on the US. And he's going to fight his battle wherever it's raging, which right now is the UK as much as the USA. Arguably, it's easier for him to fight it because no one seriously thinks that we're going to try and press a criminal case against Elon Musk. Our chances of being able to extradite him are probably zero. So it's, I'm sure he knows that. I'm sure he knows he's completely free of legal consequences as far as his action in the UK is concerned. Maybe the government could try and bring Twitter to heel. But if he decides he doesn't want to, if he decides he actually just bought Twitter to destroy Twitter, then he won't care about that either. There may be absolutely nothing we can do other than actually restrict Twitter in the UK. That may be ultimately the only leave we have. Now, that's not the way the government are talking about. They are going to try things to bring Twitter to heel in terms of meeting its obligations to avoid the spread of disinformation, which it's currently not doing. They will ultimately try to do that with threats of financial penalties over the next. This will take place over years, by the way. This won't be a quick thing. But ultimately, if that doesn't work, there's maybe not a lot we can do unless we try to organise international action and work with the United States government, who do have jurisdiction over Musk and Twitter more directly, and suggest to the US government, which will hopefully not be led by an Oompa Loompa, that it's in America's interests as well that this disinformation is not allowed to spread on social media companies based in their country and owned by people living in their country. So ultimately, this may be international diplomacy that's needed there. But, those, in terms of a lot of the main issues, I would say that have caused this, those would be them. And that doesn't even cover, as I say, what caused these people to even be persuaded that immigration or multiculturalism was an issue, which is the standard of living. Ultimately, it's the standard of living. If you talk to people about their issues with anything, whether it be multiculturalism or immigration or anything like that, it always comes down to my life's crap and I was told it was these people's fault. So why is their life crap? Because the standard of living isn't good. Housing, a lot of people can't get onto the housing ladder. Housing's too expensive. Rents are too expensive. Mortgages are too expensive as a proportion of average incomes compared to several decades ago. Everything is very expensive. It is expensive just to go out and go to the chippy or any takeaway. Things that used to be normal, that used to be able to just go out and it wasn't a hideous expense, now are an expense. Everything's an expense. When you need public services, there's, you're told there's this massive queue. We've got a queue of close to 8 million people on waiting lists for NHS elective treatments. You've got huge delays in the criminal justice system, which actually at the moment would ordinarily be helping the rioters, except the government have prioritised them. But that means we're creating extra blockages in the criminal justice system to facilitate quicker justice for the rioters. We've got, problems with people being able to access decent housing. A lot of the housing people have is poor quality, actually bad for their health, damaging to their health. And there's a lot of people who can't get access. There's a lot of people who are sofa surfing. They may not be on the streets homeless, but, if they're having to move around different friends' places because they can't get a place of their own, they're still basically homeless. And, or unable to get a decent job for whatever reason. Maybe it's something as simple as if you live where I am, it's quite isolated. A lot of people here. If they have a job, they probably don't have a job here. They need to travel to one of the nearby towns. If you don't have the transport to do that, and transport's been savagely cut under the Tories as well, then your pool of available jobs is limited, because you can only get a job where the hours are such that the relatively small number of buses can get you to your job in time and get you back without having to wait around for hours. So that cuts off a lot of work as well if you're not yourself mobile. And if you are mobile, you know, the cost of a car and getting the insurance and everything is proportionally more now than it used to be. So a lot, you know, these are also the underlying causes that allow for the lies to work. You know, a lot of people just sort of, particularly if they have seen that standard of living dropping over, say, the last couple of decades, or particularly the last 14 years. So there's lots of things in the mix, and there does need to be a serious review, and all of them need to be tackled. Although actually the standard of living is at least one that Labour were already going to deal with anyway. They already, see, again, when I come back to that original thing of, you know, why did we get no warning? We sort of did. Even Labour, before these riots, talked about the dangers of populism, the rise of far-right populism. And they'd explicitly, even before the election, talked about the need to tackle this via better quality housing, better access to public services, better access to jobs, better pay. And all of these things Labour already had plans for anyway. Interestingly, one of the latest things to come out is, I would say, another issue is we don't teach critical thinking in this country. It's one of my huge bugbears. Under the last Labour government, they started to tentatively do it, but then the Tories just completely cancelled the whole programme, and it was only tentative, it wasn't really much. Whereas we've now had the Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, announcing plans to teach critical thinking in primary and secondary schools, which is a much more ambitious programme of critical thinking teaching than was under the last Labour government. It still runs into the same problem. As soon as the Tories come back, they will completely scrap it because they don't see it as in their interest. I would argue they'd be in a much healthier position if they got behind it, but they don't. They don't see it that way. And but you know, that is also part, but that is something that will not bear fruit for a long time, because first of all, you can announce this plan to introduce critical thinking skills, but then, you know, it's like anything. Once, and I've been a teacher for over 20 years, when the government introduces a new thing, sometimes they're very good ideas, but you don't expect it to be working perfectly straight away, and then you need it to be properly embedded in, and for people to go right through the education system having been taught it properly. So you're talking, we're going to need critical thinking teaching and teaching well in school for decades before we see the benefits. And that's where I sort of get a bit dejected, because then I think, are we going to have governments that for the next few decades really get behind this, or are we going to, in 10 or 15 years time, get another government that says no need for this critical thinking, it's a waste of time on the curriculum, let's just axe it? And that is, you know, so we end up with a situation where the Labour government do the right thing, but because of the time that's necessary to see the benefits, or the major benefits, it's limited in its impact if it's then just immediately cut. But yeah, there are lots of things behind this. There's lots of, I mean, ultimately, we had a lot of weaknesses in our system. We still do, obviously, those weaknesses haven't gone away. Huge number of weaknesses in our system that have allowed for this, and it's a huge task to deal with them all. And we know that the government had already intended to deal with some of them. There are other ones they've indicated that they will tackle now, such as reviewing the Online Safety Act and introducing critical thinking into schools. And then there are other ones that need dealing with as well, for which we've had no indication from the government that they will look at, such as media reforms, or even reviewing the legislation, because although the government are currently saying the current legislation is absolutely fine to tackle those who effectively facilitated these riots, whether it be online or actively, the test is if the major players are brought to justice, because it's all right putting the rioters themselves in prison. I mean, we've had some people put in prison who didn't even have racist or even anti-immigration ideology. They just got drunk and got involved, right? And I'm not saying I have any sympathy for them, but we've already started to put in prison people who weren't, you know, who were just being stupid. They got drunk and were stupid, violently stupid, so quite right to go to prison. But if at the end of this process, and I don't know when that process will end because it could take many years, particularly with some of the more complex cases, but we need to see those who actively, deliberately spread the disinformation and organised the riots. We need to see those facing justice, because otherwise we'll end up in a situation which is all too familiar in this country, where the poor people go to prison, because that's the people who are rioting are basically not all poor, of course, but the people who are rioting were like the ordinary people. They're not the multimillionaires. I don't think any multimillionaires have been sentenced to prison yet. And yet the multimillionaire organisers and instigators, if they get away with it, then I'm going to suggest that our laws aren't robust, that our legal system isn't robust. And there should be a review of that. But at the moment, the government have given no indication of that as well. Which is why it is important that there is an inquiry into the riots. There needs to be an inquiry into the riots that looks at all of the factors. And it might be an inquiry that goes on for a couple of years. But it needs to look at all of the factors. And it needs to come out with recommendations. And the government needs to take those recommendations seriously. But there we are. As I sort my more fuller thoughts on that. Thanks for listening. Well done if you got this far. As I say, I will do these as often as I'm able. Maybe a few times a week I'll build up to. I'll keep putting posts out on the community tab of the YouTube channel if you want to suggest topics. And you know, not every topic I'll cover will be super topical. I'll cover more niche ones as well. More than happy to do that. In fact, there are a couple I've got my eyes on as well for maybe later this week. But thanks for listening, everyone. Have a great day. And until next time, I'll see you later.